On August 30th, 1945, the vast gray Pacific lay still, flattened by the wind and the recent shattering end of a global war. Aboard a U.S. Navy transport ship, a group of Japanese women huddled together, their thin clothes offering little comfort against the sea breeze. Their eyes were wide, bodies swaying with the relentless rhythm of the ocean. Some were nurses, captured on distant Pacific islands. Others, clerks, were civilians swept up in the abrupt chaos of surrender. Their pale faces, framed by carelessly knotted dark hair, bore the profound exhaustion of a nation utterly broken. A chilling quiet hung in the air, a silence heavier than any storm, replacing the roar of planes and the distant thunder of bombs. These women had grown up under the shadow of propaganda posters depicting Americans as monstrous beasts, demons with claws and fangs. They remembered the caricatures vividly, crude drawings of hulking, fanged creatures with slitted eyes, promises of torture and dishonor for any who fell into their hands. Yet now they found themselves guarded by young men in crisp khaki uniforms, men who spoke in unfamiliar accents. These guards neither spat at them nor struck them. Instead, they offered cigarettes or water with an unsettling civility, as if to strangers rather than enemies. The stark reality before them clashed violently with the warnings drilled into them through years of relentless indoctrination. Each polite gesture chipped away at a lifetime of ingrained fear. The ship groaned, its bow cutting steadily towards the American coast, carrying the heavy weight of surrender across the vast ocean. At first, the women were silent, their bodies drawn close, their breaths misting in the cool morning air. Some clutched what little remained of their possessions: worn satchels, faded photographs, a folded kimono hidden beneath military-issued blankets. Each woman carried not only these remnants, but also the untold story of her survival through capture. The weight of their past, the terror of their recent experiences, seemed to cling to them like the salt spray from the sea. One, a 28-year-old nurse named Akemi, had been stationed in a Saipan field hospital, where she witnessed friends choose death from cliffs over capture by Americans. The image of young women, resolute even in despair, haunted her sleep. Another, barely 21, named Hana, had been a typist in a garrison office when U.S. troops encircled her island, the suddenness of it leaving her breathless with fear. And a third, older than the rest, a woman called Etsuko, had been caring for children in a missionary compound when the wave of surrender swept them all into captivity. Their individual journeys were disparate, yet they shared a common, gnawing dread: what awaited them in the land of their enemy? Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of anxiety, a desperate longing for answers to their unspoken questions. The Americans on board were mostly boys, many no older than the women themselves. Farmers from Iowa, steelworkers from Pennsylvania, baseball players from Texas, now transformed into sailors and guards. They moved about the deck with a casual, almost unconscious authority, rifles slung loosely, smiles flickering when they caught the women staring. One soldier, a lanky young man with a slight southern drawl, seemingly amused, held out a Lucky Strike cigarette, tapping the pack before extending it like a peace offering. The women recoiled initially, unsure if it was a trick. Was this a prelude to mockery? A test? When Hana, after a moment of intense hesitation, finally accepted, her hands trembling, the soldier simply nodded and lit it for her, the small flame momentarily illuminating her wary face. It was a simple gesture, yet it created a hairline crack in the wall of fear built by years of indoctrination. These were not monsters. Unsettlingly, they were just men. Men with cigarettes and polite nods.
The sea voyage was long, and time aboard the transport blurred into an indistinct continuum. Days blended into nights, marked only by the shifting light and the ceaseless creak of the ship's timbers. Meals arrived at regular intervals, trays of bread, soup, sometimes even meat. The women were stunned by the abundance, a stark contrast to the starvation that had gripped their homeland. Yet, some found their stomachs too knotted with nerves to swallow more than a few bites. Nights grew colder, the bunks hard, and whispers filled the darkness as they struggled to comprehend their destination. A few murmured rumors: California, maybe Texas, places whose names sounded impossibly foreign and enormous. None had ever seen America, though many had heard of it as a land of arrogance, skyscrapers, and endless machines. To imagine themselves within it felt as impossible as imagining peace after years of air raids and rationing. The very notion of this distant land was a mosaic of propaganda and whispered fears. Yet the most unsettling realization came not from fear of what lay ahead, but from the sight of the Americans themselves. Compared to the Japanese men the women had known, thin from rice shortages, hollowed by years of conflict, their bodies etched with hardship, the Americans seemed impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, bursting with an unfamiliar energy. Their uniforms fit easily. Their boots shined. Their laughter rose above the wind and waves with a carefree abandon that felt alien. The women watched them secretly, astonished by their robust health, their full cheeks, their bright eyes. They had been told Americans were decadent and weak, soft from luxury, their easy lives a sign of moral decay. But these men, with their clear eyes and athletic builds, seemed anything but. The contradiction gnawed at them, a silent wound to their sense of truth, undermining the very foundation of their wartime beliefs. One evening, as the sun burned a fiery red against the horizon, Akimi, the nurse from Saipan, stood at the railing, staring at the glowing line where water met sky. An American sailor, barely older than 20, leaned a few steps away, smoking. For a long time they shared the silence, two figures from opposite worlds, connected only by the vast ocean and the shared twilight. When the sailor finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost shy. "You'll be safe there." He pointed vaguely towards the unseen horizon. She did not understand his words, but his tone conveyed something she did recognize. Not menace, not hatred, perhaps even kindness. She turned away quickly, unsettled by how human it sounded, by the fleeting connection that had just breached the chasm of their conflict. Inside the cabins, conversations grew bolder, hushed murmurs giving way to more daring exchanges. Hana, the young typist, whispered that the guards resembled actors from American films she had glimpsed before the war, their faces carved with an unfamiliar handsomeness. Itsuko, the older woman, mused that their smiles were frightening, too open, too free, lacking the restraint she was accustomed to. A third admitted that the tall soldiers made her feel invisible, like a child, dwarfed by their sheer physical presence. They laughed nervously, a fragile sound, but beneath the laughter lay a profound unease. If everything they had been told was false, what else was a lie? If the enemy was not grotesque but handsome, not vicious but courteous, then what had all the suffering been for? Their minds wrestled with questions they could not yet answer, questions that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their understanding. The days passed, marked by ships' bells and meals, the endless hiss of the ocean. Slowly the women adjusted, though fear never entirely receded, merely transforming into a dull ache. They began to notice small details now, the way the Americans teased each other with playful shoves, the way one whistled a jaunty tune while polishing his boots, the way another prayed quietly at night. head bowed, a small crucifix clutched in his hand. Such ordinary acts seemed extraordinary, utterly out of place in their preconceived notions of the enemy. The women had been prepared for cruelty, for degradation, yet instead they witnessed rituals of normal life. It was disarming, confusing, and strangely painful, for it reminded them of what their own brothers and husbands might have been if war had not consumed everything, if the simple rhythms of life had been allowed to continue. On the morning of August 30th, the shoreline finally appeared, a faint line, then a clearer shape, then the unmistakable outline of America. The women pressed to the rails, their hearts quickening, a mixture of terror and nascent hope swirling within them. For some, fear surged again. What trials awaited in this vast enemy land? Would the politeness of the shipboard guards be replaced by harsh reality on solid ground? For others, curiosity flared, a sharp, unbidden flame, yearning to understand this bewildering new world. The tall guards stood near them, gazing towards home, their postures easy, as if returning from a long shift rather than ending a world war. The contrast was almost unbearable. The prisoners were crossing into a land they had been taught to hate, a land that would now decide their fates. Yet standing beside them were men whose very presence contradicted every warning and caricature they had believed. The land itself seemed to loom, a colossal, unknown entity. The ship groaned as it neared the harbor, gulls circling above, their cries echoing in the damp air. The scent of land, sharper, richer with the smell of oil, salt, and coal, drifted towards the transport ship as it eased closer to the pier. For the Japanese women on deck, every detail etched itself into memory. Each visual cue a tiny piece of an unfolding, incomprehensible puzzle. They clutched their satchels and stared through the fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms pressed, rifles resting casually, their posture steady but not cruel. The women drew in sharp breaths. It was their first true sight of America, and it was nothing like the grotesque drawings that had filled their wartime newspapers. The shock was palpable, a collective gasp. In those papers, the enemy had been portrayed as hunched, bestial, faces twisted with malice, often with buck teeth and exaggerated features designed to inspire revulsion. Yet here, standing in the sunlight, the Americans were tall, clean, broad of shoulder. Their hair gleamed in shades the women rarely saw, brown, blonde, even red, a spectrum of colors so different from the uniform black of their own people. Their jaws were sharp, their eyes startlingly clear. They did not look starved or sickly. They looked strong, like men born from fields of abundance, from a world untouched by the relentless attrition of war. Hana, the young clerk, whispered to Akemi, her voice trembling, as though admitting a crime. "They are handsome." The word felt dangerous on her tongue, as if even acknowledging it betrayed something sacred, a loyalty to a broken nation. But the others heard her, and though none replied, the silence carried a quiet agreement, a shared unsettling recognition. The guards on the ship barked orders in English, signaling the women to prepare for disembarkation. Boots clanged on metal stairways, ropes tightened, and the ship shuddered against the pier with a final resonant thud. One by one the women descended the gangway, their heads bowed, a reflex of deference and fear, though their eyes darted forward, stealing glances at the soldiers who lined the path. The Americans towered over them. The average Japanese man in the 1940s stood little more than 5'3". These guards, nourished on beef and milk, reached 5'8", 5'9", sometimes taller, their sheer size overwhelming. The women felt the scale of the difference not only in height, but in the confidence of their bearing, the easy way they held themselves, as if they had stepped into a land where men were giants, a different species altogether.
The American soldiers watched silently, some with open curiosity, others with polite detachment, their faces unreadable. A few whispered to each other, but there was no cruelty in their eyes, no jeering, no sign of the viciousness they had been led to expect. One soldier, no older than 20, shifted his weight nervously when Akemi, the nurse, glanced up at him. Their gazes met for an instant, and she felt a heat rise to her face. The shame of it startled her. How could she notice such a thing here, as a prisoner, standing on enemy soil? She looked away quickly, yet the image of his face, clean-shaven, unscarred, impossibly youthful, seared itself into her thoughts, a persistent, uncomfortable presence. At the foot of the gangway, the women were guided into rows. Trucks waited nearby, their engines rumbling, ready to carry them inland. American officers walked among them, checking lists, counting softly, their voices calm and methodical. The process was efficient, clinical, yet beneath it lingered something unexpected, a faint courtesy. An officer gestured for Etsuko to adjust her satchel so it would not fall, his hand careful not to touch her, a subtle mark of respect. Another spoke slowly, pointing to the truck she should enter, his tone patient, as if explaining to a confused child rather than commanding a captive. These were gestures that contradicted every story told in Japan, where the enemy was said to spit on captives and treat them worse than cattle. The women's hearts raced with the strangeness of it, a bewildering reevaluation of all they held true. As the trucks jolted forward, the city unfolded before them, a sprawling testament to an untouched war effort. Streets stretched wide, lined with warehouses and cranes that clawed at the sky. The air was streaked with soot, a familiar industrial haze, but in between hung the sharp brightness of neon signs, English letters glowing in colors they could scarcely read, a vibrant, alien script. Cars passed by, their engines smooth, their chrome gleaming, a parade of luxury and effortless movement. America, even in a port still marked by wartime effort, looked alive, vigorous, a pulsing heart of industry and commerce. The women pressed their faces to the slats of the truck bed, astonished. In Japan, cities lay in ruins, Tokyo a field of ash, Osaka scorched, Nagoya shattered. Here buildings still stood tall, and the rhythm of industry hummed as though the war had brushed past but never broken it, merely spurred it on. Akemi, the nurse from Saipan, thought of her younger brother, who had died of malnutrition 2 years earlier. She thought of his small frame, his thin wrists, the way hunger had dulled his eyes, extinguished their light. Then she looked again at the Americans driving the trucks. Broad backs, thick arms, laughter slipping easily between them, robust and unburdened. She felt something twist inside her, a mixture of envy, grief, and wonder. Envy for their easy strength, grief for her brother's wasted life, and wonder at this enemy who had seemingly suffered so little. If the enemy had lived like this, had they ever truly known the same war? Had they known the same fear, the same privation? The trucks rolled inland toward the camps that awaited. On the way, American civilians glimpsed the convoy. Children stood barefoot at the roadside, waving with curiosity, their innocence a stark contrapoint to the women's experience. Some adults watched quietly, arms folded, neither welcoming nor hostile, only cautious, their expressions a mix of wartime weariness and lingering suspicion. The women shrank from their gazes, but what startled them most was not hatred, it was indifference. They were not spectacles to be mocked or paraded, they were simply another part of the war's aftermath, a consequence to be processed. That anonymity was both relief and sting. To be invisible was safer.
Yet it also reminded them how powerless they had become, mere cargo in the aftermath of a colossal conflict. Inside the truck, whispers spread. Hana, the 21-year-old clerk, leaned towards Akemi, her voice barely audible. "They look like film stars." The nurse frowned, but the younger woman's eyes shone with nervous awe, captivated by the unfamiliar beauty. Another older woman snapped softly, "Do not speak of such things. It is shameful." Yet even she could not deny what they all felt. The men around them, clean, tall, and steady, were not the caricatures of propaganda. They were, in a way that unsettled them deeply, admirable. The quiet admission hung in the air, a dangerous thought for prisoners of war.
The convoy reached the edges of the countryside. Fields stretched wide, green and golden under the setting sun, an endless tapestry of fecundity. Farmhouses dotted the land, their porches lined with rocking chairs, their barns painted bright red, symbols of an enduring, peaceful existence. The women stared in silence. This, too, was America, fertile, unscarred by firebombs, a land that seemed to grow strength in its very soil. The contrast to their own villages, scorched and empty, was unbearable. Some felt tears sting their eyes, though they quickly hid them, ashamed of their weakness, ashamed of the beauty of their captors' land. By the time the truck slowed at the camp gates, the women's minds churned with contradiction. They had been told to expect cruelty, yet met with courtesy. They had been warned of monsters, yet found men who looked like athletes, farmers, actors. They had imagined America as a wasteland of arrogance, yet now saw fields and cities untouched by ruin. Each glimpse of abundance made their own losses heavier. Each tall soldier reminded them of brothers buried in shallow graves, of a world that had crumbled. As they were led through the gates, a final moment struck them. The American guards exchanged laughter among themselves, tossing a baseball back and forth while waiting for orders. The ball arced high in the afternoon light, a perfect white sphere against the blue sky, caught easily by hands that seemed unshaken by war. The women stopped briefly, watching. To them, it was more than a game. It was proof of something terrifying and alluring, that America had endured with its vigor intact while Japan had crumbled into ashes. Akemi clutched her satchel, her eyes fixed on the ball as it sailed through the air again. For the first time, she felt the full depth of the question clawing at all of them. If everything they had believed was false, then what truths would this land force them to face? The ball snapped into the soldier's glove with a soft smack, and the women were ushered forward. What lay inside the camp would challenge them even more than the sight of handsome men on the docks. The gates clanged shut behind them with a heavy, final sound. But what lay inside was not the grim barracks of their imagination. The American camp stretched across rolling fields, its wooden huts neat and aligned like rows of barns, its fences tall but not menacing. Guards walked the perimeter with rifles resting lazily on their shoulders, their expressions more bored than brutal. The women clutched their satchels and stepped across gravel paths that crunched underfoot, their hearts beating in disbelief. They had expected darkness, cruelty, cages. Instead, they found order, cleanliness, and a faint smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchens, an aroma that evoked a long-forgotten sense of warmth and normalcy. On the first morning, they were woken not by shouts, but by a bell that rang through the camp like a schoolyard chime, a gentle, startling sound. They lined up hesitantly for breakfast, each tray filled with things almost unthinkable after years of scarcity: scrambled eggs, bread thick with butter, even bacon sizzling on tin plates. The younger women stared at the food, unable to believe it was truly theirs. Hana whispered to Akemi, This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo. Akemi only nodded, her eyes brimming. For months they had lived on thin rice gruel, on weeds boiled in water. Here in the enemy's land, they were handed more than they had dared to imagine. Some wept silently as they ate, ashamed that their first tears in captivity came not from cruelty, but from kindness, a profound and unexpected grace.
Life inside the camp unfolded with an unexpected rhythm. Each day followed a schedule: meals, rolled calls, medical checks, work details for those willing. The women were given uniforms of plain fabric, neither demeaning nor harsh, just sturdy enough for chores. They were housed in separate barracks from the men, their quarters lined with wooden bunks and thin mattresses. At night, whispers filled the darkness, questions of home, fragments of memory, confessions of disbelief. They spoke of husbands lost, of brothers who had marched into jungles and never returned, of children they might never see again. And always, beneath the grief, came the same astonishment. Why were they being treated with dignity in the land of their conquerors? The constant drone of unseen machinery in the distance was a stark reminder of America's industrial might, a power that now offered them sustenance rather than destruction. The Americans, too, seemed uncertain. Guards approached with politeness, handing out soap, showing where the showers were, explaining slowly, sometimes with gestures, how to use unfamiliar things like modern plumbing fixtures. One soldier laughed gently when Hana stared in wonder at hot water gushing from a tap. "It's just plumbing," he said, not realizing the miracle of it for those who had endured years of rationing and cold baths. Another time, when Itsuko struggled to carry a crate of supplies, a guard stepped forward, taking it from her hands with a sheepish smile, a fleeting gesture that bypassed language barriers. The interaction was brief, but afterward she whispered to her companions, "I thought he would strike me. Instead, he helped." The contradiction gnawed at them daily, forcing them to unlearn what they had believed unshakable, to dismantle the edifice of propaganda brick by painful brick. Not all moments were gentle. The women were prisoners, still watched constantly, their movements restricted. The fences reminded them of that with every glance, their barbed wire glinting in the sun, and the guards' rifles were never far. But cruelty did not define the place. Instead, what defined it was the strange blend of abundance and restraint, as if the Americans had decided victory was best expressed not in punishment, but in proof of their own strength, feeding the enemy, housing them cleanly, allowing them to work. These became subtle demonstrations of power, gestures that said, "We are strong enough to be merciful," a chilling yet comforting assertion. One afternoon, the women were gathered in the yard as American soldiers tossed a baseball between them, their laughter rising in the warm air, a sound of carefree masculinity. The women watched, transfixed by the ease of it, the athletic grace. Their own brothers had played with wooden bats and scraps of cloth wound into balls before the war, their games often makeshift and tinged with the weight of impending conflict. But here the game seemed effortless, an inherent part of the daily life of men untouched by hunger, unburdened by rationing. Hana whispered, "It is like watching another world." She was right. For the prisoners, the camp was less a cage than a mirror, reflecting how different their worlds had been, how vast the gulf of experience. Akemi, the nurse from Saipan, found herself studying the faces of the guards when they thought no one was watching. They were sunburned, sometimes freckled, their jaws square, their teeth startlingly white compared to the malnourished men she had nursed in the field hospitals, men whose teeth were often stained or broken. She thought of her fiancé who had gone to sea in 1943 and never returned, his memory a constant ache. He had been thin, his skin sallow, his shoulders narrow from lack of food. The men before her now looked like giants, their robust health almost an affront.
She hated herself for noticing, yet she could not stop. The contrast was a wound that would not heal. Letters arrived for the Americans, delivered in neat stacks by the camp mailman. The women watched the soldiers unfold envelopes, smile, sometimes wipe away tears before tucking photographs into breast pockets. Family seemed close for them, present even across oceans, a tangible connection to a life beyond the war. For the Japanese women, family was memory only, fading and unreachable, perhaps even gone. That divide felt sharper than the fences, a barrier of experience more profound than any physical boundary.
And yet, despite sorrow, small connections bloomed. When Itsuko, in broken English, thanked a soldier for extra soap, he replied with exaggerated politeness, tipping his cap as if addressing a lady, his gestures surprising her into a faint smile. She laughed despite herself. The first time laughter had escaped her since capture. Another day, when a sudden storm swept through the camp, the guards rushed to secure windows and roofs, one shouting instructions as though protecting his own home, his voice laced with genuine concern. The women helped too, hauling what they could, surprised at the shared urgency, the instinctive cooperation. For a brief span, captor and captive worked side by side against the wind, and afterward the memory lingered, a fleeting moment of shared humanity. Reports from the International Red Cross noted the unusual fairness of American POW camps, contrasting them with the brutal records of Japanese camps across Asia, where disease, starvation, and brutality were common. The women did not see the reports, but they lived the truth of them daily. Each bar of soap, each plate of food, each simple kindness stood as evidence against the propaganda that had shaped their world. The lies of the past crumbled quietly, replaced by experiences they could not deny, a slow, painful awakening. Yet the transformation was not without pain. Each revelation of American strength, well-fed bodies, clean uniforms, laughter that came easily, was also a reminder of Japan's ruin. Their homeland lay in ashes. Families struggled to eat. Brothers and fathers had died gaunt and broken, their sacrifices seemingly in vain. To see their captors thrive while their own kin perished was an agony difficult to bear. The women carried that grief like a second skin, a constant weight. Gratitude for kindness lived beside resentment for defeat, both heavy, both true. Akemi once stood by the fence as a guard wrote a letter home, his back to her. His pencil scratched steadily, his lips moving slightly with each word. When he paused, staring off toward the horizon, lost in thought, she wondered who he wrote to. A wife? A sweetheart? A mother? She thought of the letters she would never write, the faces she would never see again. A bitter truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. This man, her captor, might know more joy and peace in his lifetime than her fiancé ever had. She turned away quickly, but the thought lingered, haunting, a shadow over her reluctant new understanding. Seasons turned, and the war's echo softened into memory, the sharp edges of trauma beginning to blur. The women began to mark time less by fear and more by small rituals. They swept their barracks, folded their uniforms with care, tended to each other when illness struck. Some worked in the camp gardens, planting rows of vegetables under the watchful eyes of guards, their hands finding solace in the familiar rhythm of the earth. For them, touching soil again felt like touching life, a connection to growth and renewal. It gave rhythm to days that otherwise blurred, and always above the routine lingered the tall figures of American soldiers, living proof that the world was not what they had been told. One afternoon, a soldier carried a phonograph into the yard, a heavy wooden box. He cranked it, and music poured out. Swing rhythms, brassy and alive, a joyous explosion of sound, utterly alien, yet captivating. The women froze, startled by the strange, infectious sound. Some smiled despite themselves, a rare unbidden expression of pleasure. A few guards clapped in time, joking with one another, their faces alight with the simple joy of the music. Akemi closed her eyes, listening, and felt tears burn at the corners. Music, of all things, reminded her that joy still existed even in captivity. It was almost cruel in its beauty, yet it etched itself into her memory as a moment when the walls of enmity cracked wide enough to let something human slip through, a shared, transient melody.
By spring, whispers of release began to spread. The war was long over, and repatriation loomed. For many women, the thought of returning to Japan was bittersweet. They longed for home, yet feared what home had become, a land of ghosts and rubble. News filtered in of cities laid waste, of rubble, hunger, and grief. To leave the camp meant to face a nation reshaped by defeat, a place perhaps unrecognizable. Strangely, for some, the fences no longer felt only like prison. They felt like shelter from a harsher reality waiting beyond, a temporary sanctuary in a world turned upside down. When the day of departure drew near, the women gathered their belongings. They folded their coats, tied bundles, and lined up once again for transport. Akemi looked back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quietly, the fences still tall, the guards still watching. Yet in her memory, it was not the fences that remained sharp. It was the smell of bacon in the mornings, the warmth of hot showers, the polite gestures, the tall soldiers tossing a baseball in the sun. These details, these unexpected fragments of kindness, would travel with her long after the gates closed behind her, etched into her soul. As the trucks rumbled toward the harbor, the women whispered to each other, not of monsters, but of men. They looked like film stars, Hana said again, this time without shame, her voice barely audible but firm. They treated us better than we expected, Etsuko added softly, her eyes distant. Akemi remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, the highway unspooling towards an uncertain future. She felt a profound shift inside her, not toward love or admiration, but to something heavier, the knowledge that truth had been more complicated than she had ever believed. War had been built on lies, on carefully constructed fictions, but in captivity she had glimpsed something undeniable, a raw, uncomfortable truth about humanity. At the harbor, the ships waited, gray hulks ready to return them to the ashes of Japan. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched, their hearts torn between longing and dread. Behind them, America receded, its vast green landscape blurring into the mist, a land of contradiction, of defeat and unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for revenge, but for understanding. She did not yet know what awaited in her homeland, what scars the war had left on the land and its people, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human, and that memory, both painful and luminous, would not fade. It would be a beacon in the darkness, a testament to the enduring complexity of the human spirit.